Hello, my name's Anne Shelby, and I'm about to tell you 3 stories for Halloween. All of these stories are ones that people used to tell in different places in eastern Kentucky. The first one's got a haunted house in it. Well, how the whole thing got started was they got put out of their house. I don't know why, whether they was behind on the rent, or the landlord just wanted to move somebody else in there, I don't know. All I know is they got put out of their house. It was a man and his wife and their little girl. Well, this was back in the time when people didn't drive cars and vehicles everywhere. If you was fortunate enough to afford a horse, you could ride your horse, but most people was not that fortunate. And this family, like a lot of other people, they just had to walk wherever they wanted to go. Sometimes people would walk to a whole other county. So after they got put out of their house, this little family started walking down the road. They had nowhere to stay, looking for a place to stay. Well, they walked a big long way, asked a bunch of people if they knew of anything, looked around looking for a place, couldn't find anything. It got up late in the day. And then they started worried, well, where was they gonna stay all night? Their little girl was tired and hungry. And then before dark, just before dark, they looked and they saw a house over there set back from the road a piece. And it looked like a pretty good house, but it didn't look like anybody's living in it. So they went over there and looked at it. Yeah, looked pretty good, nobody around. And then they saw a feller across the creek over there out working his garden. And they went over there and asked him, said, was that place available? And what did he know about it? He said, yeah, it's available, he said, but he said, different people's tried to live in it and couldn't. They all said it's haunted. So they had to stop and think about that a minute, you know. But the man and woman, they were real sensible people, not people that was scared to walk by a graveyard of a night or jumped at everything that moved. And so they decided they'd take a chance on it. They'd stay there that night, see how it went, and then in the morning decide what to do. So they went over there, looked around. It's a big house, 2 stories. They didn't even go upstairs, it's so big. And they built them a fireplace. They had a little food with them, so fixed a bite of supper and ate it. And then they fixed their beds the best they could. And by that time, that little girl was wore out, so they put her in the bed. And then the man said, well, he said, I saw a store. We passed back down the road for about a mile. He said, I think I'll go down there, see if I can find us something for breakfast in the morning. So he left, and a woman sat down in front of the fireplace, wait for him to come back, you know. And she's just sitting there resting and watching the flames. It was getting dark by then, and the flames was, you know, how they throw shadows, throwing shadows, like dancing, wild dancing on the walls and the ceiling of the room. She sat there and she thought she heard something. Sounded like it's coming from upstairs. But again, she wasn't a real nervous type of person, so didn't think much about it. Sat there a bit longer, and then seemed like it wasn't so much that she heard something. It was more like she just felt something, like something changed in the room. And the change seemed like it was coming from over there on that staircase. And she just thought, all right, I'm just gonna look over there and see what it is. She looked over there and she saw a coffin, and it was coming, floating down the steps in midair. It's like that. And when it got to the bottom of the steps, it come and floated over about the middle of the room where she was, real quiet, and it just kindly hovered there in the air. And so then she decided it was no use running off into the night. It was no use pretending like this was not happening. She was just going to have to go over there and open the lid. So she went over there and opened the lid of that coffin. It's hard at first. Looked away. There was a dead man in there. And then she remembered what it is you're always supposed to say to a ghost when you see one. You're supposed to always say these words: in the name of God, what do you want? So she said that. In the name of God, what do you want? And that man sat up then. And he said, oh, thank you. I've been waiting 10 years for somebody to ask me that, but they always just run off. Or he was been dead so long, he was kind of like hoarse, you know. So he said, I tell you, this is my house. And some robbers come in on me 10 years ago and tried to get me to tell them where my money was, and I wouldn't tell them, and they killed me for it. And he said, I want you to go in the morning and get the law and bring them out here, and I will tell them all what happened and who killed me. And if you will do that for me, he said, I'll give you this house and this farm and everything on it and all my money besides. And then he laid back down. She closed the lid and he floated back upstairs. So in the morning, they went and got the sheriff and 2 or 3 deputies come out there, and they listened again while that man told that story. And he told like who had come in on him and killed him. And then he said I want to say this in front of the sheriff and deputies now. He said, I want to give this place, this house and this farm and everything to this little family for helping me. And he said, and they can have all my money that them robbers never could find. It's hid and under that hearth rock right there. So the sheriff and the deputies went and arrested the people that had killed him. And they're still in jail, I think, awaiting trial. And then the man and the woman and their little girl lived at that house. They worked that farm, and they done very well. And the ghost, now that it got to tell its story and get some justice, now it could have some peace. And it rested easy. And they never did see it anymore. I know another good one. I know you've heard of a gingerbread man story. This is a different gingerbread man story. Well, these all kind of families, but this next one also starts off of a family with a man and a woman and their little girl, but it's a different people altogether. But this family, this man, woman, little girl, they lived out in the country, close to the woods, and got along good. But then, right at the beginning of the story, the daddy up and died. So that left the woman and the little girl there by themselves. And they were, of course, just full of sorrow that he had died. And then, to make matters worse, though, the woman pretty soon took up with a man that turned out to be no account. At first, he seemed like he might be all right. You know, he could be charming and everything. But then as time went on, they got married. He moved in there in the house with them. And then turned out that he was a real bad-tempered man. Got mad easy. Everything made him mad. You never knew when he was going to get mad or not. And then when he got mad, he was mean, and sometimes he's violent. And he got to where he would beat up on that girl. He beat up on that woman. And different times, they both would have black eyes, bruises, sometimes even a broke bone. And the woman just kept saying, well, maybe it'll get better, maybe it'll get better, maybe he'll change. But he didn't change. It only got worse, or he didn't get better. And so then one day, the little girl got up and she was looking for her mom and she couldn't find her. Looked all over the place for her, and it wasn't like the mommy to go off like that and not tell her. So she went and asked that man, where's mommy at? And he said, she died. She won't be back tomorrow. So then the girl had lost her daddy and her mommy and was there just with him. And she suspected that he had killed her mother. And she was afraid he might kill her too. She tried to stay away from him. And then one day, he announced that he was going to town, had to go to town that day. And town is several miles off when he's walking it, so he's going to be gone about all day. But he said, I'll be back this evening, and when I get back, this house better be clean. I better find a big, good supper on the table, and all this firewood out here better be chopped. And so then he left. And that girl didn't clean the house or cook the supper or chop any firewood. She thought, this might be the best chance I'm ever going to have to get away from him. And so she took off. He went in one direction. She took off in the completely other direction and walked as hard as she could and walked and walked and walked. Pretty soon was completely out of any territory that she was familiar with, and was just walking around in the woods, not knowing where she was going or what she was going to find, but she just knew she had to get away from there. So she walked and walked, and she came to a little house out in the woods. It's a real pretty neat looking little house. And there was the old woman at working in her flowers. And so she went up to that old woman, that girl did. She was real tired and starved to death by then, And so the woman looked at and said, well, where did you come from? And the girl said, I don't know. To tell you the truth, I've been lost for 2-3 hours. And so that old woman said, well, you better come in here with me. So they went in that old woman's house, and the woman fixed them a real good meal, and they ate and talked and visited all that rest of that day and got along real good. It felt good to that girl to be somewhere, where she felt safe and like somebody cared about her. And so then, though, it was coming on night, and the old woman said, now, honey, I'm been glad to have you here, but now it's getting late. Today you better go on home. I'll show you a shortcut through the woods. And the girl said, no, don't make me go. said, I'm scared to go back there. I'm scared of him, afraid he'll kill me. Can't I stay here with you? And a woman said, no, you need to go back now. Go on back and you can come back another day. And she said, here, I'll give you something to take with you. So she handed her a gingerbread man that she just baked. And so she said, here, put this in your pocket now, and you take that home with you. You need that. And so, and she showed her shortcut through the woods. It turned out it wasn't that far because the girl been wandering around in big circles, you know. So the girl went on home. When she got there, that man was already there. And he was mad. And he's out there chopping firewood. And he said, where have you been? Said, you didn't do one thing I told you to do today. And when I get through chopping this wood, you better watch out. And so she ran up the steps to her room, closed the door and locked it, but she knew he could get in there if he wanted to. And she sat down on the bed and cried, didn't know what to do. Scared to death, you know. She could see him down in the yard chopping wood. She couldn't stand to look at him. She got up and pulled the window shade down so she couldn't see him anymore. She cried till she couldn't cry anymore. And then she got so tired, she just laid down on the bed. Well, when she lay down on the bed, she felt that gingerbread man in her pocket. You know, she forgot about it. She got that gingerbread man out, and it looked so good, and it still smelled good too. So she sat up and looked at it. It was real decorated, real pretty, you know. And but she was hungry, so she took a big bite off that gingerbread's arm. Chomp. When she did that, when she bit that arm off that gingerbread man, down in the yard where that man was chopping wood, that axe flew up in the air, come down, and whacked his arm clean off. And it fell off on the ground. Didn't bleed, didn't even hurt. But there he's standing there looking at his arm on the ground. The girl thought the gingerbread man looked funny with just one arm, so she bit off the other arm too. Chomp. And again, that axe flew up in the air, come down, whack. Cut the man's other arm off, and it fell off on the ground. Now he's standing there with no arms. The girl thought, this is the best, most delicious gingerbread man I have ever eaten in my entire life. And she started looking at its legs. She bit one of the legs off. Whack! Leg fell clean off. So then the man fell down on the ground then. And the girl decided that leg tasted so good, she'd eat the other leg off too. So she bit it off in one bite. And when she did, whack, other leg fell off. So then his arms and legs is scattered around and he's just laying there on the ground and can't move. The gingerbread man's face had candy on it for its eyes and nose and mouth, and it had icing for its hair. The girl thought that looked really good, so she bit its head off with one bite. Chomp. The man could live without arms and legs, but he couldn't live without a head, so he died. And the girl ate up the rest of the gingerbread man, every crumb. And then she was so tired all of a sudden. She just laid down on that bed, went to sleep and slept good all night. When she woke up in the morning, she was kind of surprised to find out she was still alive. But she was. She got up, stretched, went over and pulled that window shade up. And there in the yard, she saw the man's torso and his head and an arm and legs all scared all over the place. She said, well, I've got a job to do. So she went, got a shovel, dug a big hole in the ground, put all those pieces in there, and covered it back up. And then she went to visit that old woman, and they got to be the best friends of each other and the best neighbors. And the girl lived in that house all by herself and got along the best ever was. Those two stories about the haunted house and the gingerbread man are ones that I got from a folklorist named Leonard Roberts. He was a writer and a folklorist, a teacher, jazz musician from Floyd County originally, and he went around Eastern Kentucky a lot of different places in the 1940s and 1950s, collecting these old stories that by that time, people weren't even really telling them much anymore, but he could sometimes find an old person or somebody else who remembered these old stories. And so those two stories I got from Leonard Roberts. This next one I put together from 3 different stories that people used to tell around where I live in northern Clay County. In a little place called Saddler Branch. I live on Tejas Creek, and it goes into the South Fork of the Kentucky River. And the next creek up the road is Sexton's Creek, goes into the South Fork, and there's a branch of Sexton's Creek called Sadler, and that's where these stories supposedly happened. There's a lot of families still live up Sadler, and they say one ghost that they call the Saddler Booger. Now, people in old days used to say that the Saddler Booger would follow you up the holler. If you were out walking up Sadler late of a night, you could hear something walking behind you. You could hear its feet rustling in the leaves or on the gravel. And when you stopped, it stopped. And when you started again, it started again. Other people would say that if you were riding a horse up Sadler late of a night, you might feel something jump up on the horse behind you, and you might feel it's something cold arms reaching around you trying to hold on. After cars came to Sadler, people said you might be driving up late of a night, and if you happen to look in your rearview mirror, you might see the Saddler Booger in the back seat. There's another story they tell that happened on Sadler, and this one's about a pack peddler. Back a long time ago, before we had so many stores and cars and everything, pack peddlers would come around the country, especially in rural areas all over the country, and they would be these fellers that would carry a pack on their back full of just little things to sell, and they go around house to house selling in a certain area, and then they'd move on to the next. And it might be just little things that people needed, but it was hard to come by, maybe like needles and threads or silverware or some kind of little toys or things. It had to be small items, but people would save up their money for when the pack peddler came around so they could get something, and they were usually glad to see the pack peddlers coming because they tended to be friendly fellers that would like to talk and visit a while. And so this pack peddler had been in the Sadler area for a while and had been around to the most of the houses. And so then he just seemed to be gone one day, so they figured he'd moved on to another territory, maybe, already sold everybody he's going to sell to around there. And anyway, so he was gone, and then they found his body. They found his body by the creek, and looked like he'd been murdered, for his money because there was no money on him. He'd sold about everything out of his pack, but there was no money. Well, they didn't know who he was, where he come from, or anything about him, so they didn't know who to contact, that he had died. So they just didn't even really give him a funeral. They just dug the grave and put him in there. And they couldn't really do anything, try to find out who killed him, because there hadn't been any witnesses to it. Some frogs maybe, or the turtles that lived in the creek. They were the only ones that saw him. There was a man that lived around Sadler at that same time period, and this man had begun to prosper, come into some money, and he bought a house with it, bought another house to rent. And he rented it out and charged a big lot for it, would never fix anything. So he made money off of that, and then he bought a farm, and he hired some people to work it. He took most of what they grew, sold it, so he made money off of that. So he kept buying more houses and more farms, kept making more and more money, so he got to be pretty rich. But then, rich or not, he died like everybody else. Well, he had left instructions for his funeral that he wanted a big, fancy funeral, and had left the money to pay for it and everything. Well, everybody knew him. Nobody really liked him because he took advantage of about everybody one time or another. But they were going to go to this funeral and give him the big funeral that he wanted. So he was a big, important man in the community. So they lined up 6 or 7 preachers, to preach the funeral. And he got the biggest, fanciest casket that they had, the best money would buy. And then the night before the funeral, they had him laid out in it at his house. So he's in this big fancy casket at his big fancy house, but he was dead. And so everybody came, brought their children and their dogs, and everybody came to it. Because it's kind of like a big social event. And so they were going to sit up all night with the corpse, as custom was, sit up all night with the corpse. And so everybody was there, and they were all talking and eating and drinking coffee and trading knives and whittling and different things, and having a pretty good time. Youngins running around, having a pretty good time considering there's a dead man in the room. But they did that, and then as it got up later, though, in the night, some of them started getting tired, started thinking about going back to the house, Some of the youngins were falling asleep, and they'd have to be carried home. So some of them got ready, said, well, we're going to go, we'll see you in the morning, we'll see you at the funeral tomorrow. And so they was getting ready to go, and they went out on the porch to go, the ones that was leaving, and looked out there. What is that? And all out in that yard, and all in the road in front of the house, and all in the fields around the house, as far as they could see, is that turtles? It was hundreds and hundreds of turtles, all coming right that way, right towards that house. Well, it scared them to death, so they all ran back in the house, locked the doors, closed the windows and locked them. It did good because the turtles just came right on in. But they didn't hurt. They didn't hurt any of those people. They went straight in there where that casket was. And they stayed in there till daylight broke. When daylight come, all them turtles, slow but sure, turned around and went back everywhere they came from. And when they did, there was nothing left in that casket but bones. As for the Saddler Booger, now, people don't talk about him much anymore, but every once in a while somebody will say, oh, I think I saw him in my rearview mirror last night, or I heard somebody walking behind me in the woods. And once in a while somebody says, I saw something. It's like I saw somebody walking up and down the creek the other night with a pack on his back.